Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. It appears that I've just about gotten myself buried alive again. So while I try to extricate myself from this predicament, why don't I dig up another installment of the Curator's Crypt? Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I'm here to tell you about one of my favorite manuscripts from the collection. And the first thing you'll notice is it's written on long strips of paper. Now, they had regular sized pieces of paper back then, but Poe chose, towards the end of his career, to cut his paper into little strips, which he would glue end to end, like you see right here. And he'd get enough of these strips together that he could have a long scroll. He'd roll it up really tight, and when he gave readings, he could just unravel his scroll, or if you're back in the office, he could just shove it into the cubby hole on his desk. If he mailed it to somebody to publish, he would write them and say, you could just cut out whatever pieces you like so long as you glue the scroll back together. Sort of an early version of cutting and pasting. So what is our manuscript? Well, it's not one of Poe's terror tales. It's not one of his poems. It's one of Poe's essays. Now, don't change the channel. This isn't the kind of essay you've been taught to read in school. If you think about it, Poe is nothing like Ralph Waldo Emerson or any of those other people whose essays you have to read over and over again in class. Poe thought very differently than they did. He was a rule breaker at a time when critics thought a story or a poem should educate you. He thought it should impact your emotions. When critics thought that literature should demonstrate a moral lesson by depicting the virtuous as victorious and the villainous as vanquished, Poe wrote tales like The Cask of Amontillado from the point of view of a murderer who gets away with his crimes. And in tales like The Telltale Heart or The Black Cat or The Imp of the Perverse, he takes us inside the mind of the murderer and invites us to sympathize with these people, to see the world through their own eyes. So Poe thought about literature in a radically different way than the critics of his time did. He also thought about writers as being radically different than critics thought they should be. Of course, critics like to bestow honors and awards on great writers and artists. Even then, even today, critics and academies like to let us know which writers, artists, actors, musicians, filmmakers are the greatest by showering them with awards and honors. But Edgar Allan Poe had an opinion on that too. He believed that the really great writers were the ones who were misunderstood and even hated by society. In this essay, he explains that to most of the world, the true genius is so thoroughly misunderstood that they appear insane. In fact, Poe thought society must hate a true genius. Maybe Poe felt this way himself. In a letter written about the time he published this essay, he described how people had mistreated him in his time of need. He said, just when I needed aid and sympathy from them most, they turned upon me. Some with a civil sneer, others with brutal, outspoken rudeness, and left me struggling in the mire, unpitied, lonely, desperate. So that's where Poe's mind was when he wrote this essay. He was 40, barely making ends meet. But he could see rival poets like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a professor at Harvard, being honored and praised for works that Poe thought merely imitative, even to the point of plagiarism. So what did Poe write in this essay about the artist and his place in society? Well, he wrote, I have sometimes amused myself by endeavoring to fancy what would be the fate of any individual gifted, or rather accursed, with an intellect very far superior to that of his race, Of course, he would be conscious of his superiority, nor could he, if otherwise constituted as man is, help manifesting his consciousness. Thus he would make himself enemies at all points. And since his opinions and speculations would widely differ from those of all mankind, that he would be considered a madman is evident. How horribly painful such a condition! Hell could invent no greater torture than that of being charged with abnormal weakness on account of being abnormally strong. In like manner, nothing could be clearer than that a very generous spirit, truly feeling what all merely profess, must inevitably find itself misconceived in every direction, its motives misinterpreted. Just as extremeness of intelligence would be thought of as fatuity, so excess of chivalry could not fail to be looked upon as meanness in its last degree, and so on with the other virtues. This subject is a painful one indeed. That individuals have so soared above the plane of the race is scarcely to be questioned. But in looking back through history for traces of their existence, we should pass over all biographies of the good and the great, while we search carefully the slight records of the wretches who died in prison, in bedlam, or upon the gallows. So maybe Poe was onto something. After all, many of the writers whose works were praised and honored during his time are completely forgotten while we're still reading Poe today. But was he exaggerating just a little bit? If everybody hates you, does that really mean you're a genius? Or just that you're kind of a jerk? What do you think? Let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to read more of Poe's opinions on various topics from science, technology, religion, literature, art, philosophy, psychology, you're in luck, because he wrote hundreds of essays, and many of them are still in print today. And you can find a few of them by visiting the Poe Museum's online store at shop.poemuseum.org. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like these for posterity, why not become a patron at patreon.com/PoeMuseum. So thanks for joining us this evening, and I leave you with more terrifying footage of our ferocious Poe Museum cats.